was chasing pottery shards and carbon dates. I thought Chocolate's story ended in the ground, but the pod they showed me wasn't from any tree I knew. It was like holding a piece of moonlight, and when I drank their brew, the molecules spoke. They carried memories older than the earth.
From this elixir, the gods appear.
Theobroma Asterion, a detective story of archaeology, chemistry, and consciousness. Episode 1, The Shard with a Bitter Ghost. On the fourth floor of the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, the lab smelled faintly of acetone and cacao husk. Fluorescent lights hummed over racks of labeled shards, each square of pottery bearing a dusting of history and a sticker with a string of numbers like a barcode to the past. Eli Navarro leaned into the microscope, his breath held on instinct. He was young for an archaeologist with a monograph to his name, 29, assistant professor, decorated for the paper that had recalibrated the timeline of cacao's early domestication in Mesoamerica by a few centuries. Already an expert on Theobroma cacao, its botany, its stubborn bitter alkaloids, the chemistry of fermenting pulp, and the residue it leaves in clay. The university's communications office liked the phrase, the Indiana Jones of chocolate, a tagline he loathed. Across the bench, Professor Hartley gave a small cough. "We're not looking for treasure," Hartley would say whenever donors were around. "We're listening for the faintest aftertaste on a 5,000-year-old cup." Today there was no donor, only Eli, Hartley, and a shard from Ecuador delivered in an unassuming cardboard tube, a trade sample from a colleague in Quito. The tiny triangle of ochre clay kept winking with something that was not quite there when Eli ramped the magnification. "Run the LCMS one more time," Hartley said, eyes creased with interest and caution. "And check your internal standards. If this is theobromine, I'll take the faculty senate to lunch." "It's theobromine," Eli said, not looking up. "And caffeine trace. Ratio consistent with Theobroma cacao, not Theobroma bicolor." His finger traced a tiny pitted crater on the shard's surface. "But there's a third peak we can't place." Hartley's eyebrows rose behind his bifocals. "Contamination?" "I reran with blank controls and fresh methanol. It shows up only on this shard and two others from the same stratigraphic unit. Not in the labware, not in the air. It's consistent. Some alkaloid co-eluting late with a mass to charge I don't recognize." "Late retention, hydrophobic," Hartley murmured. "High ring density. Is it even botanical?" "Fragmentation pattern suggests an indole core. But there's a tetrazole substituent, that 4-nitrogen ring, that you do not see in terrestrial plant metabolites. Not in Malvaceae." Hartley looked at him sharply. "You're teasing me." "I wish I were." Eli clicked to pull up the run. On the monitor, twin peaks for theobromine and caffeine rose like low hills. Beside them, a dark mountain with an unusual shoulder. He tapped the screen. "And this is stranger still, the isotopolog pattern. The 13C abundance deviates more than 2 sigma from local baseline. The delta 15N is off too. Not enough to claim anything." Outrageous. But enough to tell me someone should go to Ecuador. Hartley folded his arms, a cautious owl. "The origins question." "I can't shake it," Eli said. "The oldest secure cacao evidence is creeping south toward the upper Amazon. Mayo Chinchipe pottery with theobromine residues around Zamora Chinchipe. But this suggests an even older tradition. And something else riding shotgun." Hartley tapped his knuckles on the bench. "Apply for the field grant. Be careful with your language. The donors respond to origins and discovery, not anomalous isotopes." Eli smiled. "I'll be diplomatic." Hartley put a hand on his shoulder. "Be rigorous." When the mass spec chimed completion, Eli printed the plot and wrote the same 3 words he would later regret: unassignable third peak. Episode 2, The Paper Road to Ecuador. The route from Hyde Park to the upper Amazon is long measured in paperwork. Export permits, sample protocol approvals, ethics paperwork to ensure consent for any ethnobotanical inquiries, small emails that stubbed toes on time zones. The field grant came with donor stipulations and 1,200 caveats. Eli smiled through them and kept packing. At O'Hare Security, a bored TSA agent lifted a vial. "What is this?" "Internal standards for LCMS, Eli said. "Caffeine, theobromine." "So, coffee." "And chocolate," Eli said, and the agent waved him through. "In Quito, thin air and the black ink of mountains." At the Universidad San Francisco de Quito, a borrowed office with a view of eucalyptus. A colleague, Dr. Valeria Paredes, hugged him at the door and handed him an espresso. "You chose a good season to chase beans," she said. "The roads to Zamora Chinchipe are less like rivers now." "Less like rivers?" "Sometimes actual rivers," she said, smiling. "We'll drive down in 2 days. First, we show you our lab." Her lab was compact, spotless. On a bench sat a boxed-up high-performance liquid chromatograph in the honeymoon glow of calibration. An Orbitrap mass spec hummed behind glass like a big cat with good manners. "Run your sample," she said. They ran it. Again the peaks rose, theobromine singing in its familiar register, caffeine echoing, and the third mountain, patient as a waiting jaguar. Valeria leaned in. "We see a similar unknown in residue from Santa Ana la Florida, but faint. Your Ecuadorian sherd is lower valley, older ceramics, and the unknown compound is louder." "What do you think?" Valeria shrugged. "I think there are molecules we don't yet know to name. And I think you should meet someone in Zamora." "An archaeologist?" "An ethnobotanist," she said. "Quichua. Name's Marisol Tapui. She works with community gardens along the Nangaritza. She's the reason most of these projects have a ghost of a chance." 2 days later, they wound through clouds as if driving inside a thought. The road plunged toward the jungle in a series of stitched switchbacks. The air turned wet and green. They met Marisol in a cafe where the coffee tasted like the noon it remembered. She was in her 40s, her braids salt and pepper, her gaze direct. She shook Eli's hand as if making a rope. "You're the cacao detective." Her smile was kind. "Only the part about cacao," Eli said. She laughed softly and slid a folder across the table. Photocopies of pottery, micrographs of starch grains, maps. "We've been collecting oral histories in Shuar and Quichua. There are gardens we call chagras that the communities maintain, some mixed with cacao trees older than anyone has counted. They say the ancestors had a moon cacao, Nantu cacao, that fruits under a particular moon. There's a clan, more secluded, who guard a grove of a peculiar cacao with very pale arils. Their elders insist no outsiders may enter, only those who are invited in dreams." "Invited how?" Eli asked, keeping the skepticism in his pocket. Marisol's eyes twinkled. "By the plant." "This is going to make my IRB nervous," Eli said. "We do this properly," Marisol said. "Consent, respect, patience, no samples without permission, and even then very small. We are guests." Valeria watched Eli with amusement. "Your third peak might have an address." "I don't want to chase phantoms," he said. "But I also don't want to ignore a lead when molecules are the ones whispering." He lifted the micrographs. "What do they call the clan?" Marisol took a breath. "They call themselves the Ishkana." "Meaning?" "Roughly, the keepers of threads." "The threads of what?" Marisol drew a gentle circle on the table with her finger. "Of stories, of seeds, of time." Episode 3, A Map of Smell. The base camp was a rectangle of canvas and habit on the edge of an island, a firm ridge between a spiderweb of creeks. Eli learned the rainforest not as a wall of green, but as a schedule. Dawn was birds gossiping in latticework. Noon was a hot, damp palm. Evening was insects scribbling their editorial. With permission from nearby communities, the team began with the known. Santa Ana, Florida's terrace system lay hours away, but they started with ridgetop middens and garden perimeters, where ancient households had boiled and poured, where lipid residues might linger in the pores of jars like the smell of past meals in curtains. They dug tidy test pits, bagged shards, kept notes clean enough to be read by someone not themselves a month later. At night, by headlamp, Eli ran micro-extractions, methanol soak, acid wash, a spin that made the vials hum like bottled bees. On Valeria's portable HPLC, he watched peaks rise. Theobromine was faithful, caffeine occasional, the unknown present in a subset, as if some recipes, some nights, had included it and others not. He kept a field notebook like a detective, each sherd a suspect, the unknown alkaloid, a witness who refused to sit straight. Before sleep, the forest performed its long jazz. Eli lay in his tent as if inside a breathing lung. He thought about Theobroma cacao, its white pulp sweet with citric acid, its seeds cradling the bitter methylxanthines. He thought about fermentation, yeasts feasting on pulp sugars, producing ethanol that acetic acid bacteria shift toward acetic acid, lactic bacteria adding their sour, the seeds heating in their own chemistry to polymerize polyphenols and set the flavor we call chocolate. He thought about theobromine and caffeine, adenosine receptor antagonists that lift a small veil on fatigue. He thought about N-oleoethanolamine and N-linoleoethanolamine, chocolate's quiet inhibitors of FAAH, the enzyme that breaks down anandamide, the body's own little bliss. He thought about how molecules are small stories and how some stories, when told in chorus, become more than their parts. On the 5th day, Marisol said, "We will go to Ishkana, if they wish to meet you." "If?" Eli asked. "They asked for your name," she said, "and for your hands. They want to see how you hold a seed." "How I hold it." "Some people grip as if they are taking, others as if they are listening." Eli washed his hands twice before the meeting. They met in a clearing where the brown river turned its head. 5 Ishkana elders sat under a thatch shelter as comfortable as a question. They were dressed simply, with necklaces of seed and carved tagua. One of them, a woman with hair silver as the river water, looked at Eli's hands for a long moment and nodded very slightly, as if he had passed an exam he had not studied for. Marisol introduced him in Quichua. Eli added in Spanish who he was, where he worked, why he cared. He explained the ethics forms and why they existed, so nobody would be deceived, so nobody's words would be used like a ladder and then kicked away. The silver-haired elder spoke, her voice a leaf's whisper. Marisol translated. She says the plant knows its listeners. Some come to cut and bottle. Some come to learn how to listen. If you are the second kind, you may enter. Another elder lifted a handful of cacao beans, pale, almost white. The arils clung like small moons around their seeds. He handed one to Eli, who held it the way one holds a newborn's foot. Not as property, but as surprise. The silver-haired elder smiled. Episode 4, The Garden Under a Sky of Leaves. They walked blindfolded the last half hour. Eli found it odd and yet fair. Respect sometimes looks like inconvenience if you measure it wrong. He could smell the garden before he saw it. A breath of flowers and clean earth, a thread of fermented sweetness, something like cinnamon and soil. When the scarf came off, he blinked in the green. The Ishkana Grove was a circle of cacao trees under a careful canopy, a living architecture of shade and sunned leaf. Pods hung like small ribs in colors he had not expected. Ivory, sea glass green, violet veined with the faintest blue. The pulp of a cut pod glowed with a very gentle fluorescence in the dusk, a phenomenon Eli had seen in lab gels and UV badges, not in fruit. "It's fluorescing," he said, unable to help himself. "Probably polyphenols excited by the blue scatter from the sky. Or something new." Marisol's smile was sly. "It pleases you." "It astonishes me." One of the Ishkana, a man named Peak, offered a shell cup with a clear liquid. "Yaku," he said, "water." Eli drank. Another elder took a fresh pod, scored it with a bone-handled blade, and split it along its seam. Pale arils spilled into a bowl. She added a pinch of ash from a small pot, its smell like roasted vines. She stirred and left it to sit in the shade. Eli watched the process with both anthropologist and chemist's eyes. The ash, if made from certain plants, could raise pH, partially deprotonating indole alkaloids and letting them pass membranes more readily. Lime had been used with maize and cacao elsewhere for that purpose. He had not seen this particular ash before. Marisol said quietly, "They call this preparation yawarchoco, blood chocolate. Not for violence, but for the color it brings to your seeing, like when you stand up too fast." "We aren't going to," Eli began. "Trip?" Marisol supplied. "We are going to listen." "There is a difference. You will be safe. The Ishkana do not give yawar lightly. They give it to those who will carry the story without breaking it." Eli nodded. Consent forms had been signed. Protocol had been discussed. But he felt that what stood between him and foolishness was not paper, but the attention of these elders. After an hour, the elder poured the thickened liquid into a smaller cup and handed it to Eli. He smelled it first. There was cacao's dark, an undernote like crushed leaves after rain, and something unfamiliar, a bright metallic whisper. He met the silver-haired elder's eyes. She nodded once. Eli drank. Episode 5, Pharmacology of a Voice. It came on not with a hammer, but with an unplugging. The default hum in him, the internal narrator who comments on every moment, lowered its voice and stepped aside. The forest was suddenly differentiated into layers: insect, leaf, cloud, air. Each leaf had a contour that felt important because it was. He had expected visual geometry, the lattice work that 5-HT2A agonism produces, sacred geometry woven by the brain's cortical networks, touching each other more widely than usual. He had not expected taste to become story. With each breath, he felt molecules binding, methylxanthines nuzzling adenosine receptors, A1 or 2A, to remove the filmy shawl of tiredness, polyphenols sinking into his gums, and something else, an indole with an ornamented ring, difficult, precise, sitting in the 5-HT2A binding pocket like a key that had been measured, filed, tried and tried again over generations. He lay back on a woven mat. The canopy moved like the inside of a lung. The silver-haired elder spoke softly. Marisol translated in a whisper. She says, "The plant is a story that learned to speak chemistry. Do not argue with it. Ask it who taught it to speak." Eli closed his eyes. He had read MRI studies, the dampening of the default mode network under psychedelics, the increased global connectivity, the loosening of priors. He had taught undergraduates about prediction error and Bayesian brain models. None of that prevented the shock when a voice as clean as a plucked string spoke in his head with the calm of weather. "We were placed," it said. Images stitched themselves with an economy that made him feel clumsy. He saw a hillside under a different sky, the stars unfamiliar. He saw hands that were not human plant, a pod, the way one tucks a thought into a drawer for later. He saw within the plant a peculiar biosynthetic pathway. Tryptophan to tryptamine, then elaborated not into serotonin's family, but into a tryptamine with a tetrazole ring, a substitution not found in plant alkaloid textbooks, an arrangement that would not survive gut mao unless inhibited. He saw within the same plant a suite of beta-carbolines, harmine cousins, skeletons that on paper belonged to vines hundreds of kilometers away. He saw within the fat of the bean N-acylethanolamines that slowed FAAH. He saw theobromine's quiet blockade of adenosine receptors, making the brain less apt to nap on the story. The voice was neither male nor female. It was not human. It was not a voice in the air, but the way a chord sounds when two strings resonate on the same note. "You will want the name of the compound," it said almost kindly. "What is it?" Eli whispered. Marisol squeezed his hand, assuming he asked her. The elder answered in Quichua, "Nyawi, I." The palm of Eli's hand tingled. He saw the structure in his mind's eye the way chemists do when thinking without pencil. An indole ring with a tetrazole at C4, an ethyl chain to a dimethylamino, akin to DMT in backbone, alien in ring, 4-tetrazolyl NN dimethyltryptamine, call it TZDMT, an oral tryptamine unlikely to be deminated swiftly due to a tetrazole's electron sink, made more durable by the presence of reversible MAOA inhibitors in the same brew, and quietly shepherded by methylxanthines to a waking consciousness. Sigma-1 also lit like a pinprick, that curious chaperone receptor that DMT whispers to in vitro. He felt absurdly like he had just been kissed on the surface of a cell. "This is impossible," he said, and the plant did the closest thing a plant can do to a shrug. "You will find the pathway. You will doubt the origin. You will think of horizontal gene transfer. You will collect the seeds of explanations as if they were fruit, and you will always be a little hungry." The canopy folded into night. Stars appeared like the slow revival of old friends. He had the unmistakable sense not of being told a myth, but of being shown an origin story in the only medium that could cross that kind of distance without losing itself. "Metabolism," the elder murmured. Marisol's translation was a thread. "She says we were taught that the plant came from those who needed to remember how they became they. They could not carry libraries. They made a plant that could carry a certain way of seeing. They placed it where someone would listen. We listened. Sometimes the plant chooses a listener to carry the story farther." Eli had one thought, surprisingly practical. "We have to sample." Marisol squeezed his hand again. "Only with their permission." Pick stepped forward. He held a small obsidian flake like a ceremonial scalpel. He sliced a paring from the interior of a pod. He offered it to Eli, who placed it in a sterile vial with hands that felt made of someone else's nerves. The voice in him said, with a certainty that was less instruction than weather report, "You will not be believed, but you will be listened to by the ones you most need." Episode 6, The Third Peak's Shadow. 2 days of dawn to dusk listening, then slow goodbyes. The Ishkana gave their consent for Eli to take 8 microsamples, each smaller than a fingernail clipping. In exchange, he promised to share all results with them first, to remove precise geographical detail from any publication, and to respect their right to refuse any future extraction. They walked out without blindfolds. Trust has its own geometry. The road back to Loja was a rope on which rain balanced. Eli and Valeria took turns driving. Marisol dozed in the back seat. A pickup loomed in the mirror. It kept a polite distance. Eli did the forensic calculation of, "Is this my paranoia?" and came up with a non-zero probability. At a gas stop on a ridge, the pickup rolled past, and he saw a face he recognized too quickly. Professor Hartley sat in the passenger seat, head turned to the flanks of cloud. The driver looked familiar too. It took a second to place him. An alumnus of a donor's biotech startup, Obol Labs. Eli had seen him at a donor dinner, a name attached to funding that had paid for pipette tips and a portion of a mass spec. Valeria followed his gaze. "Friend of yours?" Eli's mouth went dry. "Mentor! And the other man?" "Trouble," he said, quiet. In Loja, at the small lab with the obedient Orbitrap, Eli ran the Ishkana sample. Peaks rose in orderly coronation. The third peak was not only there, it was a mountain range. High-resolution mass spectrometry gave them the precise mass of the parent ion. Fragmentation read like a poem in careful handwriting. "Tetrazole," Valeria breathed, pointing at the fragment with -42 atomic mass units. "We're in fiction." "Not anymore," Eli said. They ran isotope ratios. The delta 13C value was anomalous in a way that would make reviewers itchy. Not impossible for a terrestrial plant grown under unusual conditions, but odd. The delta 15N skewed heavier than expected, and there were trace inclusions, microscopic spherules in the seed coat mineralization, that under SEMEDS showed nickel-iron ratios with chromium isotopic anomalies, similar to carbonaceous chondrite dust. "Meteoritic," Valeria said, a scientist clinging to the ordinary ladder even as the floor moved. But how would that incorporate in seed coats? Dust in soils? Many places are eyes of meteor showers. Pervasive across multiple seeds, Eli said. Not a one-off. As if someone mixed meteoritic dust into the growth medium on purpose. Marisol, reading his face, said, Don't build a bridge too fast, Eli. He nodded. We need to eliminate 1,000 possibilities. He wrote it on the board, big. Eliminate everything you can. Underneath, don't break the story. That night, someone cut the tent. The samples were locked in hard cases inside the lab, but Eli woke to the sound of nylon tearing and the unmistakable hiss of moving air where there ought not to be. He grabbed a headlamp, flicked it on, and caught a silhouette at the edge of canvas. They ran. He followed. Outside, rain was a skin over things. The figure jumped the ditch and slid down a muddy slope behind the hostel. By the time Eli caught up, a truck door slammed and taillights smeared on wet gravel. He stood in the rain until he felt like a line drawing of a man. Back inside, the lock on the lab hadn't been touched. But on the bench was a note written in neat block letters. Some stories should be bottled, not published. We can help. Oh, Obel Labs. Valeria swore in a regional dialect sophisticated in its insults. Marisol put a hand on Eli's shoulder. We move the samples, she said. We go to Quito in the morning, and we tell the Ishkana. We promise to keep them safe, Eli said. Marisol looked at him without softness. Promises are only as strong as the trouble they are asked to carry. Episode 7, Ghosts in the Orbitrap. Quito again, thin air like glass. At USFQ, they locked the samples in a safe within a safe. The director disliked drama but liked security. Eli slept for 12 hours and dreamed in mass spectra. When he woke, he found an email from Professor Hartley, from hartley@uchicago.edu. Subject, field updates. Eli -- Quito, heard a rumor. Be careful. Let's talk. A.H. Eli called him. Hartley answered on the second ring. You're here, Hartley said. You too, Eli replied. Hartley exhaled. I told them not to follow you. Them is Obel Labs, Eli said. They left us a note. They want to bottle a story. Obel is enthusiastic, Hartley said softly. They've been good to the department. Instrument grants, scholarships. They have a biotech patent library that treats the world like a menu. They also make actually useful medicines, Hartley snapped, then calmed. Listen, I'm not your enemy. Obel's director heard whispers about cacao that did more than keep you awake. They threw money in every direction. Did you tell them about our third peak? I told them nothing. Someone else did. I came to keep them from swallowing you whole. Eli closed his eyes. 100 grad seminars, 1,000 after-class chats, all the small kindnesses that made mentorship real. And here the same mentor was pragmatic in the exact way that got labs funded and sometimes got them eaten alive. I need to say this aloud, Eli said. We are dealing with a plant that synthesizes a tetrazolyltryptamine and beta-carbolines. We are dealing with a community that has safeguarded it. We are dealing with isotopic anomalies I cannot explain by soil alone. And we are dealing with a company that would like to own the patent on an origin myth. Hartley sighed. Then fix your story to the rock of method. Do not be sloppy. Publish cleverly. Give reviewers less to hate. And keep the location sealed. You know the drill. We promised more than the drill, Eli said. We promised the Ishkana a veto. That too, Hartley said quietly. And Eli? Yes? If a seed can carry a story, then a lab note can carry it too. Keep your note safe. Someone cut my tent, Eli said. I would have told you Obel wasn't that crass, Hartley said, but they hired some field contractors who believe we are all living in a movie. I will talk to them. Talk fast, Eli said, and hung up. He opened his notebook. He made a new section, chain of custody. He dated everything like a notary. He labeled digital backups with hashes and stored them in 3 places. He wrote to the Ishkana in Quechua, Spanish, and English what they had found so far in molecules and metaphors. Then, with permission secured for one more run, He and Valeria fed a sliver of the Ishkana bean into the mass spec and pushed the button like the first time one knocks on a locked door, knowing someone is home. The machine sang in ions, the screen filled with careful bars. The tetrazole tryptamine was real, the beta-carboline sweet, harmine analogues elongated and methylated in ways a vine would envy, was real. There were N-acylethanolamines enough to lift a single eyebrow in a neurologist. There was theobromine, there was caffeine, there were polyphenols, bright with catechins, nothing illegal, nothing that could not be found in cousins. And yet, together, like a chord voiced a certain way, it was something else. Eli named the unknown, if only for his notes, Asterionine, partly because its tetrazole was a little star of nitrogen, partly because he had dreamed of a star while the plant spoke to him. He did not use the name in any document that could leave the lab. Episode 8. The Labyrinth and the Thread. If this were only chemistry, we might have published in a year, but archaeology is a chorus, not a solo. The story had to move through ceramics and hearths, through phytoliths and starch granules and the geometry of terraces. It had to pass Bayesian models of radiocarbon dates like an applicant sitting for 100 exams. Valeria mapped the region's known sites with drones and LIDAR borrowed via favors. Hidden terraces appeared as ghost geometry under canopy, concentric ridges, radial alignments. Marisol traced oral histories across communities. Some families remembered a time before the Yawarchoko, when only pulp was taken. Others told of a night when the moon fell into the fruit, a phrase too poetic to be accident. Eli began to see a pattern. Sites with the theobromine plus caffeine pattern without a third peak clustered in older ridges of one drainage. Sites with the third peak appeared like satellites on a slightly different elevation band tied to other stone alignments. He mapped star positions 8,000 years ago because archaeologists sometimes see heaven stitched to earth by those who loved both. The radial alignments matched not a common solstice, but a set of stars not exactly ours. The pattern was off, as if the grove had been aligned to a sky unwatched here. He took a sketch to Marisol. She stared at it a long moment and then laughed softly. "You think like a storyteller. What do you see?" "A map inside a myth," she said, "or a myth inside a map." He brought the sketch to the Ishkana. The silver-haired elder studied it and shook her head. She pointed not to the stars, but to the lines between them. "Hilu," she said, and Marisol murmured, "Thread." "You drew the wrong thing. We don't align to points, we align to the ways between." It seemed a mystical dodge until Eli overlaid river paths, trade trails, the periodic fall of a certain migrating bat that loved to chew pulp and spit seeds at a certain distance. He felt a door open at the hinge of data and story. At midnight, between document edits, he returned to chemistry. He ran docking simulations with an offline program, watching Asterionine slip into the 5HT2A receptor's pocket like a key whittled by a careful grandmother. He read about Sigma-1 and had the unnerving sense of reading a diary penned by a protein. He thought about theobromine slowing adenosine's lullaby and how that might widen the window of listening. He thought about beta-carbolines giving oral tryptamines a passport. He wrote in the notebook, "No one molecule is magic. The choir is." When he finally slept, the plant was there as patient as gravity. You could call it alien and be lazy, it said, or you could call it placed and be honest. We were taught to tell our own myth through another mouth. Our ancestors seeded us with a plant that gives us shape to attention. They told us, sing ourselves into the ones we want to be. We wanted to remember how waking happened, so we planted waking. He thought he understood until it added, we were not the first to sing it either. Episode 9, The Bottle at the Gate. Obol Labs requested a meeting. They sent an email with polite fonts. They offered research support, publication assistance, legal protection. They mentioned IP in a tone that made Eli feel he needed a shower. They met at a hotel with a lobby too clean to have a story. The Obol delegation included the alumnus from the pickup, a lawyer whose tie was a geometry proof, and the director, a woman with eyes like unlit glass. Professor Hartley came, softer at the edges as if sleep had worn him. The director smiled a "we are friends" smile. "We respect your work, Dr. Navarro. We want to help you turn it into a medicine." "It is already a medicine," Marisol said, her voice mild as rain and twice as inevitable. "It treats separation between people and the more-than-people world. Your clinic cannot bill for that." The director's smile didn't move. Imagine the indications. Depression, addiction, end-of-life anxiety. Imagine a standardized extract, precise dosage, controlled conditions. Imagine making the listening you describe available to those who need it. "Who's listening?" Eli asked. "What you want is the bottle. You want to put a seed in a child-proof cap." The lawyer folded his fingers. "We can protect your data." "From whom?" Valeria asked. "From public scrutiny? Or from the people whose garden it comes from?" The director kept her voice level, perfumed with reason. "This will happen with or without you. With you we can ensure consent, revenue sharing, cultural credit. Without you, someone else will do it badly." Hartley cleared his throat. "Obol's point is that—" "Professor," Eli said gently. "Please." Hartley looked at his hands. The director turned her gaze back to Eli. "You've already published on Cacao's archaeology. You are a public figure." "Your PR team wrote that figure," Eli said, and the lawyer's smile tightened. "What do you want?" the director asked. "Protection for the Ishkana. Their veto power over any use of their plant. A clear statement that nobody has any patent rights over anything that would prevent the Ishkana from using their plant the way they always have. And if, years from now, something derivative arises, an agreement that the Ishkana Foundation we set up will receive royalties and power in governance." The director listened and said nothing for a very long breath. "You have just described the path that makes this least profitable for us." "Then you shouldn't take it," Eli said. "What's your tone?" the lawyer said without heat. "The tone you want," Marisol said sweetly, "is the tone of understanding that the world contains things that do not want to be owned." The director stood. "We will be in touch." "Please don't," Valeria said. As they were leaving, Hartley touched Eli's elbow. "They will come anyway." "I know," Eli said. "Keep your notes safe," Hartley whispered, "and keep your friends closer." Eli felt the small tremor in Hartley's voice. The mentor was standing between forces like an old tree in wind it had not been told to expect. "Come with us," Eli said, and for a second he thought Hartley would. Episode 10. The Memory of a Stone. Back in the valley, the Ishkana listened to what had been said. The silver-haired elder nodded after each sentence, as if these were expected lines in a play they had been performing for centuries. Then she stood and took them to a hill Eli had not seen before. The path was narrow, the kind that assumes you belong there. On the summit stood a stone like a patient tooth. On one side, faintly, were carved a grid of lines that under lichen were not random. The elder wetted a cloth and pressed it to the stone. The lines darkened, a map. Eli felt a small panic. The stone contained coordinates, if you knew how to read them, a gentle path to a gentle grove. The elder's hands moved over the grid with a familiarity that made him feel like a child in a library he had not earned. Marisol asked, and the elder answered, "The stone teaches us to find the grove if the grove must move." Eli heard the plural and felt his stomach shift. Groves, not one. A distributed risk. A decentralized myth. The elder moved her finger to a tiny spiral at the corner of the grid. Eli leaned in. The spiral was not just a spiral. It contained tiny marks like notches. Counting made a number with no immediate meaning. He copied it in his notebook anyway. Later that night, he sat by the river and tried the number as a base for a calendar. He tried it as a coordinate for a star catalogue. He tried it as a prime. It wasn't. He tried it as a ratio, as a frequency. Nothing fell into place until he thought of chirality. Life, as we knew it, favored certain hands, L-amino acids, D-sugars. But certain abiotic processes on meteorites yielded a tiny excess of L, possibly due to circularly polarized light in star-forming regions. The number on the stone matched within error the L excess measured in certain carbonaceous meteorites. He laughed out loud. A single bark that startled a nightjar. Then he stopped laughing because somewhere in him the plant said a word very softly. Remember? He went to Valeria's tent and showed her the number. She rubbed her eyes, saw the meaning, and then stared at him as if he'd turned into an equation. You think the stone is a memory of a sky before ours. Or a memory of the recipe for life as sung by light, Eli said. Or I'm losing my mind. Both can be true, Valeria said kindly. They sat in the threshold between sleep and thinking, while the river worked out what a rock meant when it was water. Episode 11. The Thread Pulls Back. Obol did not come with men in boots. They came with a drone that buzzed high and far, searching for clearings whose spectral signature matched cacao. Marisol whistled once. A boy appeared like a tone made flesh. He nodded when she spoke and vanished with a slingshot. An hour later, as the drone swooped for another pass, a small object snapped from the canopy and the drone's left rotor coughed. The machine scissored into a gentle branch and died with a sigh. Eli watched it with an inappropriate swell of satisfaction. Then the edge of the satisfaction faded, replaced by a knot of unease. Obol would come again, not with drones but with papers. They would buy land. They would hold documents like machetes. He went back to the mass spec. He fed it a thought and a sliver of bean. He wanted something that could not be litigated, only understood. The data came like dawn. Asterionine was absolutely there, and it had siblings, compounds with heavier rings and lighter ones, a family like a choir. The beta-carbolines were present at microdoses, enough not to sing alone but to underwrite others' songs. Theobromin was present at levels that should not keep anyone up all night but would keep the door ajar. He calculated pK of values, partition coefficients, predicted blood-brain barrier permeability. He wrote oral bioavailability next to asterionine and smiled without gloating at the idea of a tryptamine laughing in the face of gut MEO because it had brought its own chaperones to the party. He sent an encrypted summary to 3 peers he trusted like ribs, a chemist in Basel who could smell bad data from a photo, a neuropharmacologist in Montreal who had once taken a vow against mysticism and then broken it, and an archaeobotanist in Oaxaca who could identify a seed from its shadow. He asked only for one question. Do you see what I see? He did not mention groves or drones or stones. He told the Ishkana that more people were now listening because they had to. The elder said, "Listening is not owned. We can share." Eli nodded. That truth, simple as water, made the legal letters in his inbox look like dried leaves. That night, Yahuachoco again, a smaller cup, the plant with its steady humor. "You want a twist," it said. "No," he murmured. "I want a thread." "Twists are just threads turned with attention. We can give you one." He saw a hall in the University of Chicago where portraits of professors watched with oil eyes. He saw Hartley Young in a field in Peru, drinking something from a gourd, his face surprised into silence. He saw Hartley 40 years later, eyes faintly reflective like someone who had looked at a lake at noon too long. He saw a lab notebook with a doodle that matched uncomfortably the tiny spiral on the Ishkana stone. He woke with his heart a metronome. In the morning, he brought Hartley a cup of tea and said, "When did you drink?" Hartley closed his eyes. "In 81, he said, with the Kamikuros. It was not this, but it was a branch on a similar tree. You know this field, Eli. People act like gods and fools. I tasted something that told me not to be either. And then I raised money for machines. Not as grand as the plant would have liked." "You have a spiral in your notebook," Eli said. "Did you think it meant anything?" Hartley's mouth quirked. "I thought it meant I was not alone in seeing threads. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I did not want to be a mentor who looks at your work and says, 'This is about me.' It is not about me." "It might be about all of us," Eli said. "That too," Hartley whispered. Episode 12. The Place That Moves. The Ishkana gathered as a flock of decisions. The silver-haired elder stood in the center. "Obol will make papers," she said, Marisol translating. "Papers are leaves. They dry. We will move our garden. You will anchor your story in things that cannot be owned, stars, stones, and how people breathe when they listen. We will also teach you a thing you have not asked." They led him to the grove. An elder named Tzara dug carefully at the base of a tree, not to uproot, but to touch the fungal threads, mycorrhizae, that connected roots in a gossip network. She showed Eli a pattern of knots tied with dyed fibers and hung from branches at a low height, a quipu of soil. Each knot corresponded to a moisture, a fungal thickness, a pH reading not measured, but felt by those who had been in that garden longer than any instrument had. Eli looked at it as if someone had just shown him a library card for dirt. He went back to his tent and wrote a paper that would be review-friendly. Evidence of early cacao processing in Ecuador with novel alkaloid signatures, heavy on the instruments, modest in claims, long on methods. He wrote in parallel a second paper that would be placed not in Nature but in a small journal that liked the seam between knowledge forms. A piece on consent as method and how some stories are relayed by plants to humans and back, and how to write a materials and methods section for a ritual without making it into a recipe. He sent both to the Ishkana before sending anywhere else. They edited with a hand that was gentle and firm. They changed discovered to witnessed in 3 places. They replaced rare tribe with community. They struck a sentence that, without malice, had made them ornament rather than authors. He changed the text and felt the sentence exhale. The Basel chemist wrote back, "I see your tetrazole and I raise you a hypothesis. The enzyme that makes it is a moonlighting nitrolase that has no business making tetrazoles unless its active site was tinkered, not by humans, by someone who likes puzzles." The Montreal neuropharmacologist wrote, "Your docking looks real. This isn't LSD potent, but it's persistently weird. If this were built, it was built to be a teacher, not a hammer." The Oaxaca botanist wrote, "Your plant is a story with leaves. Guard the storytellers." He slept with the letters under his pillow as if he were 12. On a day like any other, the Ishkana led them to a different grove. It was similar in feel, different in detail. They had moved the heart of the garden. Places, like cells, can bud. The old grove would go feral for a season and seem ordinary. The new would hold the quipu that told roots where to speak. Eli realized with a jolt that he had not been entrusted with a location. He had been entrusted with a way of moving the location so the story could not be bottled. Episode 13. Origin Story. They held a final yahuachoco under a sky that was beginning to think about rain. Eli drank with the humility of someone who had learned how little his first questions had asked. The plant spoke not in sentences now, but in timbres like wood. You can tell apart with your fingers. It laid out a picture that was less origin than pattern. A species somewhere else had grown minds the way trees grow fruit, slowly, with insects helping, wind, luck. They had discovered that certain molecules, placed at certain gates of the nervous system, encouraged attention to turn like a lens toward its own making. They used those molecules like scaffolding in the construction of a cathedral of self-awareness. They used and used until, one day, they didn't need the scaffolding to hold the shape. Then they did an odd thing that, when told in English, sounded sentimental, but in its own context was engineering. They planted their origin story as a plant on worlds that could garden. They made not copies, but variations, local cuisines of the same meal. They seeded cacao-like organisms with pathways bent toward attention, nested with fail-safes, avoidances of harm, small doses like whispers, carriers that would ensure the setting was wakefulness and community and not a stupor alone in a room. They placed meteorite dust in the soil mix to tune chirality biases because their myth remembered a time when light singed left-handedness into amino acids. They put a tiny L-XS ratio into a stone so that, if the plant were lost, some descendant might rebuild it from memory and number. They left nothing like a ship, nothing like a beacon, They left a garden. They trusted that any mind worth speaking with would recognize a garden as a grammar. It was a smug plan in some ways. It was also generous. It assumed company. The Ishkana had listened long enough that their ritual had matured the plant into the exact choir it had wanted to be. Methylxanthines to keep you awake, asterionine and its cousins to open gates, beta-carbolines to escort the tryptamines past dismissive enzymes, N-acylethanolamines to loosen certain pleasures, polyphenols to tame inflammation enough that thought could hear itself. No molecule was magic. The garden was. Eli wept quietly, because to be shown that you are not alone is to be relieved of a loneliness you did not know how to name. The silver-haired elder touched his shoulder. You will go back to your city. You will say only what can be heard without the garden, but you will carry the taste. That is enough. He nodded. We will protect your grove. She smiled with the patience of a gardener who knows carrots teach patience whether or not you agree. We will protect ourselves. You will protect the thread that touches your world. Episode 14. Reviewers 2 and Other Earthly Forces. Back in Chicago, the winter air had the clean cruelty of a scalpel. Eli sat at a seminar table before 20 graduate students and told them a version of the story no less true for being trimmed. Early cacao in Ecuador, novel alkaloids, the caution required when your work could make someone rich. A hand rose. Dr. Navarro, do you believe in aliens? I believe in gardens, he said. A laugh moved the room like a small wave. I believe in how chemistry can be used to teach attention. I believe some stories are older than our categories. And I believe the word alien is often used to avoid relational responsibility. If someone planted something, we owe the planting the courtesy of listening and asking who else is listening. Reviewers did what reviewers do. One asked whether tetrazoles existed in any known plant. Another asked whether the beta-carbolines could be contamination from ayahuasca vines. Eli provided data, gene expression arrays hinting at an unusual nitrulase family, plant root samples that did not show Banisteriopsis DNA, negative controls, spiked standards, the caution of a dozen caveats. He did not mention Asterionine's nickname in his notebook. He did not mention voices. One reviewer complained about anthropomorphic language in a paragraph about consent. Eli fought to keep the sentence that said, some plants are not raw material. They are partners in practices that sculpt attention. He won by replacing partners with participants, a concession that made him roll his eyes in private. The paper published. Scientists emailed in varying flavors of curiosity and salt. Obol Labs released a careful statement about respecting communities and the importance of rigorous science. They filed 3 patents anyway, carefully worded to be about methods of combining methylxanthines with indolic compounds for psychiatric indications. The Ishkana Foundation, preemptively formed by Marisol with pro bono counsel, filed a challenge that did not block Obol outright, but slowed them the way molasses slows a fall. Hartley accepted a Lifetime Achievement Award and used the speech to talk about how we are wrong to think science has one voice. It has a choir, he said, and nodded to Eli as if he were pointing to a staff where a new note had been placed. Eli slept poorly for a month. He woke with the taste of cacao in his mouth and the sense that there was one more twist the plant had withheld because he was not yet braced. It arrived as a letter with no return address, typed on a machine that made the words look like artifacts. It contained a single paragraph. We have seen your asterionine. We saw it once before in 1974 in a sample labeled Unknown Alkaloid Ecuador from a missionary physician's trunk. We did not understand it then. We meet at the Harold Washington Library, 3 p.m., reading room, ask for star milk. Marisol, reached by a secured call, said, "Do not go alone." He did not. Valeria was in town for a talk. Hartley insisted on coming, less for protection than to witness. In the reading room, a woman in her 70s with hair cropped like someone who loves swimming smiled at them and said the code phrase. She introduced herself as Sister Clara. She told them a story of a mission clinic in Zamora in 1974, a fever patient given a brew by elders who chewed seeds like prayers. The fever broke. The sister, who had taken biochemistry before her vows, took a sample and sent it to a lab. The lab reported DMT adulterated with something peculiar. The report was filed and forgotten because nobody knew who would care. Sister Clara slid an envelope across. Inside was a photocopy of a chromatogram with a third peak that looked like a mountain seen through fog. In the margin, a note in the physician's hand, origin myth in a cup, then in a different hand, a spiral. Hartley touched the page like it was a baby bird. "We are late," Sister Clara said kindly, "but we can be on time now." Episode 15. The Surprise Under the Seal. One last twist came not from chemistry, but from bone. A lab in Basel, the chemist friend, sent a file with a subject line that made Eli's throat close. Proteome. The chemist had taken a sample of Ishkana cacao seed coat and looked at its minor protein component. There, curled among storage proteins and enzymes, were tiny peptides with odd amino acids, non-canonical ones that the plant had substituted like beads in a necklace. A tetrazole-bearing amino acid, stable enough to thread into a chain, not in a position critical for function, but there like a monogram. The chemist wrote, "I have never seen a plant sign its name in amino acids. The ratio of L to D at a single residue is also not standard. It's like a watermark of chirality, a watermark in proteins, not in structures that perform crucial duties, but in ornamental loops that do no harm. Anyone trying to bootleg the plant's pathway would replicate the alkaloids and miss the signature. The signature said, 'We were here.'" Eli took a walk by the lake under a sky that thought it might snow. He laughed once, again that single bark. The plant that looked like any cacao to an untrained eye had placed a signature where only a combination of care and obsession would find it. Not in the obvious metabolite, not in the gene, in the stitching of minor proteins that only someone who loved both peptide quirks and stories would watch. Back in the lab, he wrote a paper he did not submit, on watermarks and hospitality. He argued that maybe the point was not to prove an alien origin, that would only call forth arguments, but to demonstrate a standard of hospitality, how to host a story. He gave a public lecture with slides of cacao blossoms magnified, small pink stars that hide under leaves, and with one slide, only one, of a grid of numbers. He did not explain the grid. He did not explain the spiral. He watched the audience's attention lean like plants in a window. After, a woman in a cardigan approached. "I am not a scientist," she said, "but that slide made me feel like when I open a window and the air is different." "That is the whole experiment," Eli said, and meant it. Episode 16. What was placed, what we place. He returned to Ecuador 6 months later. Rain came as if being paid by the hour. The Ishkana had moved the garden again. The old grove looked ordinary, lovely but quiet. In the new grove, the kipu of soil hung in a way that made Eli feel he could hear fungi gossip if he held his breath. They drank yawachoco without fans and cameras and PR. The plant's voice was now less a voice than a capacity to hear what had been said already. "You worry about proofs," it said. "But proofs are for courts more than for gardens. Make the proof be the way you behave." "I'm afraid," he confessed, "of doing this wrong, of making a story into a commodity, of being used as a valve in someone's pipeline." The plant did not reassure him. It offered work. Teach consent like method. Teach that some data are not extractable. Teach that sampling is intimacy, not extraction. Teach how to listen without recording. Teach people to share the taste without the coordinates. Plant a story that can't be turned into a product because the product is the relationship that cannot be bottled. When he woke, he found that the silver-haired elder was watching him with the kind of tenderness that older people have for earnest younger ones who are trying too hard in exactly the right direction. "You will make mistakes," she said. "You will fix them." He nodded. He gave her a gift, Not money, not a censor, but a copy of a children's book he had found in Quito about gardens that move. It was in Quechua and Spanish. She laughed. He felt foolish, and then not. On the last night, they sat by a small fire. Hartley, who had flown down and now sat with hands open, looked like someone who had put down something heavy and was surprised at the lightness. Marisol told a joke about Obol that made everyone groan. Valeria sang a song in a voice like instruments carefully tuned. Eli looked up. The stars over the Amazon were careless with their abundance. He tried to hear the original sky to which the first planters had aligned their garden. He could not, but he could feel the way attention can span distances if given a chore it cares about. He thought of the bottom of oceans where messages travel by pressure and resonance, of underground mycelia trading sugars for news, of cilia reading flow. He thought of how humans, stubborn and wet, make tools that mimic what we cannot easily do in our bodies. He thought of mass spectrometers, beautiful humming beasts that read the breath of atoms, and the way some of the best moments in science feel like gossip overheard at the exact right time. He breathed, and the plant made his breath feel like a thread that had been here before him and would be here after. Episode 17, Threads That Don't Break. Back in Chicago again, winter again, Eli met with a small circle of colleagues who had read drafts that smelled like gardens. They agreed to set up a network of labs that would accept guidelines for working with community-guarded plants, community veto, benefit sharing, location confidentiality, data escrow that gave time for local review, language practices that insisted on with rather than on. They called it the Thread Network. It sounded quaint. It was a wager. Obol relented, not as a surrender but as a pivot. They understood that a fight against Story could make them villains in a way money did not like. They signed an agreement with the Ishkana Foundation that held enough teeth to bite. The director sent Eli a one-sentence email. "You are stubborn in a way that made it easier to be decent." It was the kindest insult he had received. He taught undergraduates not to fetishize the unknown, not to run at alien like moths. He taught that some unknowns are invitations to change behavior, not invitations to conquer with definitions. He taught the chemistry with the crisp joy of mechanism drawing, electrons as small stories, rings as choices, receptors as chairs that want certain shapes of guests. He continued to get letters. Some were from people who wanted to make a copy in a lab. He replied with science that made theft harder and welcome easier, the watermark in the protein loops, the microbial soil conditions that shaped expression, the small structural differences between Asterionine and its less social cousins that made synthesis fussy and uninterested in scale. Sister Clara wrote to say that the mission clinic had been turned into a community health center with an herbal garden larger than the church. She enclosed a photo of a little boy with a seed necklace. He looked like mischief. Hartley retired. At a reception suffused with alumni who would donate to keep the mass spectrometer's heater coils warm, he stood and said, "When we say origin, we often mean beginning." But origins are more like recipes, adjustable, communal, memorized by hands. Eli taught me that the best way to be a scientist is to make yourself into someone gardens want to invite. Someone in the back clapped too early. It made the rest of the room smile and then clap with honest timing. Eli went home and made hot chocolate the way one of the Ishkana had shown him. Whisked cacao with water, a pinch of salt, a breath of ishpingo bark if you can get it, not too sweet. He drank and felt the methyl xanthines lift a thin veil and felt nothing else. The ritual is not a machine. Without the right garden, the right hands, the right listening, the brew is simply bitter and beautiful. He dreamed, because the mind practices, of a universe where origin myths travel as plants. He dreamed of gardeners on an exoplanet aligning groves, not to points but to paths between them. He dreamed that once in a while someone somewhere drinks attention and hears very faintly the sound of a species telling itself what it hopes to grow into. Episode 18, Epilogue, The Bottle That Refused. In the years that followed, graduate students went to Ecuador to learn not how to extract but how to ask for permission. Some stayed to work on water projects, land rights, bilingual education, because a plant had taught them how to look at a problem without forcing it into a bottle. A neuroscience lab in Montreal published a careful EEG study showing that low-dose asterionine in a lab setting without the Ishkana's ritual decreased alpha power modestly and increased the brain's between network connectivity in patterns familiar to other tryptamines, but with a persistence that suggested not intensity, but stamina. Reviewers argued. Grants were awarded and rescinded. Humans behaved as humans do. A philosophical journal published Eli's piece, peer-reviewed, footnoted, on hospitality as method in archaeological chemistry, in which he argued that when evidence suggests placement, obligation follows, to the placer, to the placed, and to those who have been listening. It was cited by people you would expect and people you would not. Obol Labs formulated a non-psychoactive cocoa beverage loaded with theobromine and polyphenols, and marketed it as wakeful warmth. Eli rolled his eyes and drank one on a red-eye flight, and slept better than he expected. The Ishkana garden moved with the quiet joy of a trick well done. At the edges, younger Ishkana invented songs that made fun of scientists while teaching their children the knots for drought and wet, for fungal gossip, for the pH that makes a story more likely to sing. Someone painted a mural on a school, a plant with stars in its seeds, and a small figure holding a cup with the focus of a surgeon. On a bookshelf in Chicago, Eli kept a cup carved from a gourd that he did not use. He kept next to it a stone with a spiral scratched by a child he had not met. He kept next to the stone a page from a lab notebook with 4 nitrogen atoms circled like a constellation. Sometimes he thought the plant had chosen poorly in picking him. Someone else would have been more dramatic, more messianic. Then he remembered that a garden chooses for patience and for attention, not for noise. He kept working. He sent money and attention where both mattered. He drank hot chocolate like the small ceremony it is. He slept less than he meant to. He laughed sometimes at the absurd seriousness of molecules. He wept in the ordinary way. On an ordinary afternoon, he was walking past the botany pond when a student stopped him. "Professor Navarro, do you have a minute?" The student held a ceramic sherd like the beginning of a sentence. "I think I found something weird." He took the sherd, placed it under the light, and saw it. A faint stain that might have been gum, might have been centuries. He smiled. "Let's listen," he said, and in a lab that smelled of acetone and hope, they began again. Appendix, field notes, selected. On theobromine and caffeine, the Ishkana cacao maintains the typical methylxanthine profile, a predominance of theobromine, trace caffeine, trace theophylline. Their ratio in our sample was approximately 2.7 to 1 theobromine to caffeine, consistent with domesticated cacao. The role, antagonism at adenosine receptors, A1/A2A, promoting wakefulness. The Ishkana insist the brew is always drunk in community, during daylight or early evening, never alone in the early hours. That fits the pharmacology, wakefulness married to invitation. On asterionine, a tetrazolyl-substituted tryptamine structurally analogous to DMT, but bearing a tetrazole at the 4 position of the indole. High-resolution MS and fragmentation consistent with C13H15N7. Docking studies suggest 5-HT2A affinity in the low nanomolar range, not a sledgehammer like LSD, but persistent given oral bioavailability. The tetrazole's acidity, pKa approximately 4.9, adds hydrogen bonding and lipophilicity that, with dose, may permit BBB crossing. Oral activity likely requires concurrent reversible MAOA inhibition, beta-carbolines present at microdoses, plus adenosine antagonism to maintain attention rather than sedation. On beta-carbolines, harmine analogues present in the microgram per gram range, methylated variants unique to this plant. Activity as reversible inhibitors of MAOA at doses too low to produce independent psychoactivity, but sufficient to scaffold tryptamine survival. On endocannabinoid-adjacent molecules, N-oleoylethanolamine, OEA, and N-linoleoethanolamine, LEA, present, known to inhibit FAAH, may prolong endogenous anandamide levels, modulating affect. Chocolate contains such species in ordinary beans. The ishkana's concentrations are modestly higher and paired with the other ensemble. On isotopes, delta-13C and delta-15N values deviate from regional baselines, plausible under specific soil and microbial conditions, but suggestive of soil amendments with meteoritic dust. Microscopic nickel-iron spherules in seed coat mineralization show chromium isotopic signatures consistent with carbonaceous chondrites. Interpret with caution. On proteins, minor seed coat proteins display non-canonical amino acid incorporation, including a tetrazole-bearing residue. Ratios of L to D at a control site show slight D excess, inconsistent with standard terrestrial biosynthesis. Whether this is biosynthetically introduced or a post-translational mark remains to be tested. Likelihood favors biosynthetic tinkering. On ritual, preparation includes ash from a specific liana-free wood mixture. Ash raises pH of brew slightly, aiding alkaloid absorption. Fermentation time is controlled by taste, not timer. No step-by-step is recorded here by choice and consent. On ethics, consent is not a form but a practice. The Ishkana Foundation holds veto and purse strings for any derivative work. Location details are withheld in line with do no harm, and consent is method principles. Coda, what we keep. This is the kind of discovery that frays the edges between disciplines and kinds of knowing. You could tell it as a thriller, men in trucks, drones, lawyers, but then you would miss the quieter headline. That a plant taught a city how to host a story. That a lab became not a factory for certainty, but a kitchen for attention. That a garden refused to be a bottle, and so taught hospitality disguised as chemistry. If someone asks you years from now whether it was alien, tell them it was placed. If they ask by whom, say, by those who believed that consciousness to evolve needs teachers that refuse to be owned. If they ask what the plant does, say, it doesn't make you see things that aren't there. It makes you attend to what is, in a way that changes what can be. If they ask how you know, say, I listened, and I did not listen alone.